And we begin tonight with a terrifying concept that is currently our reality. Right now, the Republican Party's presidential frontrunner, a twice impeached, twice indicted, liable for sexual abuse former president, is openly running a campaign on autocracy. New reporting from the New York Times today breaks down all the ways Donald Trump and his allies are planning to expand presidential power if he's elected in 2024. And that goes beyond just using the Justice Department to go after his political enemies, as he has already promised to do. The Times writes that Trump and his associates have a broader goal: to alter the balance of power by increasing the president's authority over every part of the federal government that now operates by either law or tradition, with any measure of independence from political interference by the White House. That includes bringing independent agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates the media, and the Federal Trade Commission under direct presidential control, reviving the practice of impounding funds, refusing to spend money Congress has appropriated for programs a president doesn't like, and stripping employment protections from tens of thousands of career civil servants, making it easier to replace them if they are deemed obstacles to his agenda. Now, all this is not a secret. It's happening not behind closed doors. They've been openly broadcasting this plan at rallies and on Trump's campaign website. But now some of those directly involved in this multi-million-dollar operation have been saying the quiet part out loud. Russell Vought, who ran the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump White House, told The Times, quote, "What we're trying to do is identify the pockets of independence and seize them." While John McEntee, a former White House personnel chief, said, "Our current executive branch was conceived by liberals for the purpose of promulgating liberal policies. There is no way to make the existing structure function in a conservative manner. It's not enough to get the personnel right. What's necessary is a complete system overhaul." And it's not just Trump's campaign shop. There's a network of conservative groups who are backing this effort, like the Heritage Foundation, the organization that's been shaping Republican policies since the Reagan administration, not to mention the Supreme Court. And if you're asking yourself why they're doing this, I have three words for you: power, money, and deregulation. The Times writes, the agenda being pursued has deep roots in the decades-long effort by conservative legal thinkers to undercut what has become known as the administrative state, agencies that enact regulations aimed at keeping the air and water clean and food, drugs, and consumer products safe, but that cut into business profits. And their plan to dramatically increase presidential power is all under the legal guise of the unitary executive theory, which should sound familiar. It's this idea that because the executive branch is headed by a single person, that person, the president, is the ultimate policymaker. Supporters of this theory believe Article 2 of the Constitution makes it so that the president is essentially immune to checks and balances from Congress and can, as Donald Trump has said, do anything he wants within the executive branch, and no one can stop him. This is not a novel concept. Reagan administration lawyers developed the theory to advance their deregulatory agenda, and George W. Bush's administration floated it after 9/11. But what Donald Trump is vowing to do is to take that to the next level. With the help of conservative billionaires, he's essentially running for office on the idea of turning the presidency into a dictatorship. And while none of this is surprising, it is incredibly alarming, especially considering that Trump remains the Republican Party's frontrunner, which very well means that the 2024 presidential election may determine whether or not the United States of America remains a democracy. Joining me now is Michael Beschloss, MSNBC presidential historian, and Joshua Stanton, president of the Defense of Dignity Center and counsel at Perry Law. Thank you both for being here. And I will start with you, Michael Beschloss. You've covered the presidency for a very long time. This concept that they've created of essentially unitary president who cannot be stopped by Congress or anyone in the executive branch, what do you make of it?
It's ridiculous. There is no such thing. This is an invention. If we brought James Madison back, who did much to invent the system that we're talking about, his whole thing was balance of power, checks and balances between three branches, co-equal, a president, a Supreme Court, a Congress. And so what we've got now is, and he's telling us 16 months before the next presidential election, Donald Trump is the first person, the only person in all of American history who has said, if you elect me, my intention is to establish, just as you're saying, Joy, a presidential dictatorship. Telling you, the American people, your family, everyone you know, your friends, others, every private aspect of your life, if you're running a business, there's not going to be an independent Federal Trade Commission. Donald Trump will tell your business what to do. If you're part of a media organization, as we are, there will not be, for instance, an independent Federal Communications Commission. Donald Trump, if he hears something on MSNBC or another network or doesn't like something he reads in the New York Times, which is probably pretty likely, he can do a lot to have, what we do, what all of us do, stilled and perhaps even those organizations abolished. We've never seen anything like this in American history. All I'm saying to our friends who are watching us tonight, take this very seriously. Don't think this is a joke.
Right. And Mr. Stanton, I struggle to find the liberals who created the executive branch. I struggle to find them in the people such as Mr. Madison and Jefferson, et cetera. They weren't liberals. But the second part of what Mr. Vogt said, I think, is the point. You can't create conservative outcomes unless the president, and it's a president we like, has complete control. So just from a legal standpoint, talk a little bit about this idea. I'm going to read, let me before you do that, let me read a little thing from The Economist. It says Republicans believe that they will be able to enact their program only if they first defang the so-called deep state by making tens of thousands of top civil servants sackable. These changes would give an overmighty president direct control of the Department of Justice. By being able to sack all the purported dissenters, the administration would obliterate the norm of legal independence. If so, Trumpian resentment would be channeled into concrete vengeance. The prospect should concern all Americans. It's essentially Viktor Orbanism or Putinism in America.
That's right. This is an extreme and dangerous theory that even fairly right-wing legal thinkers generally have not subscribed to. And just to have some understanding of how fringe this is, when Justice Alito was up for confirmation for his Supreme Court seat, and more recently when Amy Coney Barrett was up for confirmation on her Supreme Court seat, both of them responded in relation to probably the most significant Supreme Court case governing the powers of the presidency, which is Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which governs specifically what the president can and cannot do and what Congress can regulate and legislate and prevent the president from doing. In each of them, Alito and Coney Barrett suggested that they thought that that was the right law. So what we're talking about when we think about a fringe theory, this is a theory that's to the right of, further right of what Alito and Coney Barrett have already said. So yes, this is a dangerous theory.
Michael, it strikes me that it is also it's an admission of defeat in terms of the culture, in terms of them admitting that the outcomes they want and that his fans want. And the reason they love Trump is that he's promising to bypass democracy to implement the things they want that a vast majority of Americans don't want. It's Nixon, but much, 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 much worse.
Much, much, much worse. Exactly, Joy. And here's a situation where they're gaming the existing system. They're not talking about doing things that are illegal, interestingly enough. And there's a parallel for that in Germany in 1933. Hitler, and I'm not comparing Donald Trump to Hitler, but in terms of a system, Hitler basically used the existing system in Germany in 1933 so that the will of an angry minority was translated into power and dictatorship. Exactly the same thing happening here. If we had asked all Americans in a fair poll, do you love democracy? I would say probably, 70% would say I do. Do you think that there should be abortion rights? Do you think that the press should not be intimidated? Do you think businesses should not be dictated to? I would say probably 65, 70% of Americans would say, no, I'm terrified by those things. But what the Trump people are doing is they're taking advantage of a defect, a flaw, a weakness in our system that goes all the way back to 1787, which says that if you game it, if you manipulate it, If you appoint certain people to the Supreme Court, which is owned 1/3 by Donald Trump appointed and people who like him, Congress may be dominated by Republicans 16 months from now. If all of that happens, the will of an angry 30% minority, or maybe a little bit more than that, can be made to rule all of us, and Donald Trump will be made into our dictator.
Right, and there'll be nothing to ever remove or stop him.